Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui. My name is Colin Keating, and I'm the moderator for our panel this afternoon on international institutions. We've got, as you can see, three speakers here, and I'll introduce them first, and then I'll say a few words to begin the conversation. We've got just over an hour, and so hopefully we will have about 20-25 minutes for questions after the panel members have spoken. As you know, this session is about where to next for multilateral and regional institutions. And our first speaker will speak to that question in the global context, and our first speaker is Victoria Hallum. Victoria is the Deputy Secretary, Multilateral and Legal Group in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Previously, she was the Ministry's Chief International Legal Advisor, and she's had postings overseas in Paris and in New York, and she's also worked in Maritime New Zealand and Callaghan Innovation. Our second speaker, who will speak from the regional perspective, is from Malaysia. Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik is Professor of International Relations at the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies at the National University of Malaysia. And our third speaker is from the United Kingdom, Professor Richard Whitman. He's Professor of Politics and International Relations in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. And he is Senior Fellow on the UK in a Changing European Initiative. Now, I need to also say that the Institute of International Affairs is extremely grateful to the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria University of Wellington for supporting the travel of Professor Cheng-Chwee Kuik, and also very grateful to the Erasmus Plus grant, which comes via the University of Canterbury, which has enabled Professor Richard Whitman's visit to New Zealand. Now, we have heard throughout all of the presentations this morning and this afternoon a common theme about the challenges to the international rules-based order. But I think we need to step back and recall that for most of human history, the kind of events that we have seen last year with the invasion of Ukraine by President Putin, what we saw 25 years ago, the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. For most of human history, this has been the norm. Aggressive leaders make war against neighbours and competitors. And if you dip into any history book, you'll read of the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, and it's obvious that for so long, conflict has ravaged towns, country, and the victims have been almost always innocent civilians. So war and aggression and coercion was normalized international behavior. In fact, legitimate tools in any leader's policy toolkit. But in 1945, a radical change happened. It happened largely because the international community was so motivated by the horrors of the Second World War, when over 75 million human beings were killed or died as a result of the conflict. What happened in 1945 was a decision in establishing the United Nations system to take war out of the toolkit. Aggression was made illegal under the UN Charter. and this fundamental change was intended to end the scourge of war. Instead, disputes, security challenges, problems between neighbours were to be resolved through multilateral institutions. And the United Nations Charter had 3 relevant chapters. Chapter 6, which dealt with the peaceful resolution and prevention of conflict. Chapter 7, to deal with the truly exceptional cases when conflict was unable to be prevented, and the international community would collectively decide to use force to resist aggression. And Chapter 8, which was a very special and important role for regional institutions to play in preserving international peace and security in their regions. The other important change in 1945 was to recognise that the roots of conflict, aggression, often lay in economic and social problems, in resource issues, in the lack of human rights. So new institutions were created to build new structures, new norms, to cover the weaknesses in international law in the areas of human rights and the environment. But 80 years down the track, when we look back, we see that those institutions seem very shaky. They are less relevant, they're often ignored, they're big on talk, and they're short on action. Many people thought that perhaps the tragedy of COVID-19 might bring the international community to its senses and lead to a radical change in behaviour. Some people also postulated that perhaps the Ukraine war will also be that kind of turning point. It remains to be seen, and perhaps we hope our panellists today will give us some insights as to how they see the international community going at the global level and at the regional level, and what hope there are for regional initiatives or global initiatives, as the title of this conference is about solutions to the future. And I now would like to give the floor first to Victoria Hallum to speak from a global perspective. Victoria.
E nā mana, e nā reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tēnei toko mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohe nei. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Thanks, Colin, for the introduction. And it's great at the end of a day where we've mostly been talking about relationships and partnerships to get on to global institutions, which is my world and the world of many of my colleagues. We've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to make a couple of introductory remarks, and then I basically have 3 points. So to start with the introductory comments, we've heard a lot about how grim the geostrategic context is, and that is no doubt true, and that is having an impact on multilateralism. But multilateralism, and by that I mean that when multiple countries come together to develop shared solutions to common problems, has always been a hard slog. There was never some halcyon day where that work was easy. It involves the delicate balancing of competing interests and tensions to create packaged solutions to very complex problems. Think about UNCLOS, which took 20 years from the beginning of the third conference on the law of the sea until UNCLOS entered into force in 1994. That certainly wasn't easy. And then, of course, multilateral institutions are affected, possibly even infected, by the geostrategic tensions of our era. How could they not be? These institutions are made up of the member states, so they reflect the same issues that are facing member states politically. However, they do offer the potential to channel and organise power into more productive lines, provided there is the political will to abide by these solutions. And then the third introductory comment I want to make is that on one level, the challenges that we are seeing in the multilateral system, in our global institutions, are actually a product of their success. The United Nations started with 51 member states. It now has 193 member states. We've seen the economic institutions go from the 23 members of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to 164 members of the WTO and 25 observer governments. So it stands to reason that these organisations will be struggling to deal with the current context. So now to turn to the topic at hand. How are we in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the Foreign Ministry, how are we looking at how we engage in these institutions and in the challenging issues they're covering? In practice, it's a combination of choosing the areas where you're going to hold and defend the line along with other like-minded partners, and where you are going to invest and develop new frameworks and new institutions through the application of creative energy. So I'll say a little bit about holding the line first. And a great example of this is what the international community is doing to respond to Russia's aggression on Ukraine. Now, we've heard enough today to understand how challenging that is to the rules-based order and the UN Charter. It's a direct assault on the UN Charter to have a P5 member of the UN Security Council openly conducting a war of aggression. There's nothing I can say to diminish that, but what I would say is that other parts of the UN system have actually held up relatively well in the face of this situation. And the two I want to touch on are the UN General Assembly, the other principal political institution of the United Nations system, and the International Court of Justice, the primary legal institution. Because we've been able to see there that those institutions are to an extent providing a counterbalance to the inability of the UN Security Council to respond. So I think it's highly significant that UNGA, using the Uniting for Peace mechanism, was able to come together only a week after the invasion and specifically call out Russia's action as aggression and a violation of the UN Charter. The resolution, if you have a look, is actually entitled Aggression on Ukraine. That was a strong response from the UN General Assembly. And this condemnation from the UN General Assembly has actually held up pretty well, in spite of some of the divides that we know are affecting the UN system and other international processes. The resolution that was adopted on the one-year anniversary of the invasion had a similar level of support, 141 votes in favour and only 7 votes against. And another small bright spot that has happened the month after the invasion is something that's described as the veto initiative, which is something New Zealand championed with a core group of other countries. And it doesn't resolve the veto, of course it doesn't. The veto has been the bug in the code, the bug in the system that was built in from the start. We know that. But what the veto initiative does is means that the General Assembly is no longer reliant on the UN Security Council to take a majority vote to send the use of the veto to the UN General Assembly for debate and discussion. Now, as a consequence of the veto initiative, the UN General Assembly can initiate that discussion of its own account. So that's a small piece of progress. Turning now to the International Court of Justice, I think it also is helping in these difficult times to serve as a guardrail for some of the core rules and principles that make up the rules-based international order. And there we saw, less than a month after the invasion of Ukraine, the court made binding provisional measures, that's legal speech, for something akin to an interim injunction, not as effective as an interim injunction in domestic law systems, but conceptually the same thing and binding at international law. The court made binding provisional measures demanding that Russia should immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. And that was because of a case taken by Ukraine under the Genocide Convention, which directly pushed back at Russia's attempt to pervert the Genocide Convention and use it as a false justification for its illegal war of aggression. Now, that is something that we have been quite focused on. We've heard quite a lot today about some of the support Aotearoa New Zealand has been giving directly to Ukraine, support of a practical nature. But in the legal area, we were the third country to formally intervene in the Ukraine-Russia case, immediately after Latvia and Lithuania. And that is now a case that has more interventions, more third-party interventions, I think, than any other case, which is another way that we, alongside with like-mindeds, are showing our support for the core principle of law, which is the prohibition of aggression. And then, in addition, we have the fortunate situation where the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction, and we've added our voice to that by being one of the countries that referred the situation to the prosecutor of the ICC, and that has led to indictments. So now I want to turn to some of the situations where, notwithstanding the very difficult geostrategic environment, the UN system is actually delivering new frameworks and new solutions, and that area is global biodiversity. And there's been two very successful, important outcomes within the last 6 months. So some of you may know that in December 2022, after 4 years' hard work, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted with 23 specific targets and 4 long-term goals. Now, while that's not perfect, we do think the new global goals and targets are ambitious and will make a difference. And we were very engaged in that, and one of my colleagues Rosemary Patterson, chaired one of the main negotiating processes that led up to the outcome. Then a few months later, in New York, the Global Oceans Treaty, or the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, was adopted after nearly 20 years of work. And that is the most significant evolution of the UNCLOS Law of the Sea framework since that framework was adopted in 1982. So it's pretty significant, I think, that notwithstanding the difficult environment we're working in, there is the potential to still develop global rules, global frameworks in areas that really matter. So before I run out of time, I just wanted to think a little bit about what the ingredients were for the successful outcomes on global biodiversity. And I mean, to some extent, it's quite boring. It's just the usual one: long, hard work. The final day of the BB&J negotiations, which I led for New Zealand, were 37 hours long. That is the longest working day of my life. So you have a lot of delegates on the point of exhaustion, but finally reaching a solution. I think the fact that both negotiations came very close to failing is probably an ingredient in its success. I heard someone suggest in those early hours at my meeting that in order for multilateral negotiations to succeed, you actually need all the key delegations at the same time to reach the conclusion that they're going to fail, and then something shifts and there's room for agreement. Political level engagement is a key ingredient in successful multilateral outcomes, and Minister Mahuta has been very interested in the global biodiversity negotiations and has kept a close eye on it. I think also the fact that in both cases, delegates knew the world was watching. Civil society mobilised very effectively and kept the negotiators to task. And then I think the fact that different participants in a multilateral negotiation often hold different views, even about what the negotiation is primarily about, can be seen as a positive. because it's the effort required to bring together seemingly incompatible views that often unlocks a new way of addressing an issue and a new solution, the package deal. And that certainly seemed to be the case in the BB&J negotiations. We had the situation there where one group of countries, mostly the developed countries, saw the negotiation as being primarily about better marine conservation. But then another group of countries, primarily the developing countries, saw that the negotiations were primarily about achieving equitable benefit sharing from the commercialisation of marine genetic resources. And it was only when we were able to come together and acknowledge and accept that the other view needed to be accommodated that you start to build the basis for an enduring solution. And in both biodiversity negotiations, I think it's highly significant that we would not have got the outcomes had we not come up with acceptable solutions to finance the capacity building and implementation of the agreements. And I think there's a broader message to be taken from that, and I think I've heard it in some of the other panels today. We need to find better ways to finance development if we are to resolve the most challenging issues of our multilateral institutions, and it's only by doing so that we will unlock the progress that we are looking for. And that's perhaps one of the big global divides that's had less attention at this conference today. We've talked a lot about geostrategic tensions between some of the large players, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the changing aspirations and role of China. But in the multilateral organisations, it's often the North-South divide that is really present in the room and needs to be resolved and addressed to make progress. So before Colin cuts me off, I'll just acknowledge that I've talked mostly about what the system is doing, the areas where it's achieving progress, the areas where perhaps we are just holding the line, trying to keep hold of core principles until we are in a better time. However, of course, there is the perennial subject of UN reform. The system we have dates from 1944, 1945. It was never perfect in the beginning. There were bugs in the code from the start. So what is the prospect for addressing some of these? I think it's really hard to say. There is a huge reform agenda being considered at the UN. There are some multiple important summits coming down the line. You may be aware that the UN Secretary General has released our common agenda, and there are multiple proposals out there. I think some of them will succeed. It's hard to say at the moment which ones will. The global agenda for peace, I think, is one that I would recommend you look at. It contains a lot of things that are dear to the heart of New Zealand foreign policy. There's also good momentum on the Global Digital Compact. That it tackles some issues that were not really part of the SDGs and also need to be part of the international framework. Then there's something called UN 2.0, which contains a lot of the more sort of practical housekeeping, sort of procedural improvements that my colleagues and I over the years tend to like working on. But probably none of this will unlock, none of this will be possible without some reform to the international financial architecture. So I suggest that's probably the area where we need movement first, and the developing world will be looking to have some successful outcomes from the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, which is happening in September this year. So I would also watch that because I think we need a positive outcome from that summit in order to maintain faith in the system. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Colin Keating, for your kind introduction. and a very good afternoon to everyone. It's such a great pleasure for me to be here today, joining this group of distinguished panelists, and also having the opportunity to meet with all of you. This is actually my very first trip to New Zealand, so let me thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the invitation, as well as Asia New Zealand Foundation, Susanna Jessup, and also her team, and not forgetting CSS, Victoria University of Wellington, particularly Professor David Cappy, and also his team for all the kind of arrangement. So for the next 9 minutes that I have, I intend to do two things. Number one, let me provide a Southeast Asian perspective with my rather strong Malaysian accent about the relative roles and also the relative limitations of ASEAN as a regional grouping. What ASEAN is particularly good at, what we are particularly weak and also limited, yeah? So that would be the first part. And the second part would be on the basis of what I'm going to provide. I thought I should also relate to the main theme of this particular panel and also a conference. So what's the next step, and what are the, should we be pessimistic, optimistic, or perhaps cautiously optimistic? So first thing first, ASEAN. How best can we talk about ASEAN in few minutes rather than a 3-hour lecture? So since I do not have 3 hours, let me just share and use 3 points, 3 I's, to share some quick, very brief assessment as to how best can we see ASEAN. So next time anyone asks your opinion about ASEAN, remember these 3 I's. ASEAN is a 3I entity. It's imperfect, ineffectual, but indispensable. Let me elaborate. It is imperfect in a sense that when it comes to dealing with issues like territorial disputes, South China Sea particularly, when it comes to dealing with a big power competition, the giants are fighting, I think ASEAN as a regional grouping will be quite limited, right? It's imperfect, and this is not the kind of ASEAN's blame. You don't expect EU to solve the kind of territorial big power issue as well. Some would rely on NATO and all that, but ASEAN or Asia doesn't have NATO or alliance. Not that I'm promoting that solution. I won't. I'm on the opposite side of evocation. But that's the first I. So ASEAN as an imperfect entity. And ASEAN is also ineffectual. Ineffectual when it comes to deal with problems that has a lot to do with national sovereignty, internal affairs, things that particularly about the Myanmar problem, Myanmar crisis. The current situation was not the first, it's not going to be the last. And there are many other sovereignty related issues that ASEAN as a regional grouping just cannot have too much role into that. And that's one aspect that I know our next panelist will talk about EU, and when talking about ASEAN. I always think that even though ASEAN and EU are both a regional grouping, but we are very, very different in the sense that we both learn from our own historical experience. And we thought that regional grouping is one of the key, not necessarily the only, but one of the key approaches and solutions. I think European countries learn from the 2 world wars, so on and so forth, that too much emphasis on sovereignty is bad for everybody. And therefore, you need to relax, surrender a little bit, selective action. We in Southeast Asia, we are the opposite. We went through colonizations, centuries of colonizations. So for us, sovereignty is something very, very important. So ASEAN regional grouping for us is not to surrender or relax national sovereignty, is to actually to reinforce sovereignty. That will be a very important point, and therefore we are always in a dilemma, sovereignty and also humanitarian intervention. It's a big dilemma issue that we will continue to face. This brings me to the third I, having highlighted the 2 I's, imperfect and also ineffectual. So I don't intend to give a very pessimistic analysis. Indispensable, it would be something that all of us, either you are in ASEAN or outside ASEAN, we need to bear in mind. Indispensable in what way? In so many ways. Number one, the largest problems for Southeast Asia region, as a region of huge diversity, within and across the national boundaries is our diversity. We are so different in so many ways. For a long time, back in Cold War, Southeast Asia was described as Balkan of the East, Balkan of Asia. We have all the reasons to fight with each other. We did have something small, luckily small, and not too long, 3 years, confrontasi, which of course the New Zealand Commonwealth Forces, AMDA, came to our rescue. But there was a period, confrontasi launched by Indonesia against newly formed Malaysia, shows that in fact this pattern can be a prominent principal pattern in Southeast Asia, region of diversity. But after establishment of ASEAN 1967, we have seen that ASEAN has been playing a big role, indispensable role, in managing intra-ASEAN differences, meaning problems, either bilateral or multilateral problems within ASEAN fellow members. This is something that by then, I think by now, many outside of the region, I think take for granted, thinking that we will always be a region of peace. We in Southeast Asia, especially we in Malaysia, we know that intra-ASEAN problem is always a big problem that will continue. And therefore, we have been very cautious. And ASEAN is also indispensable in the sense that although we cannot manage, we cannot solve big power competition, but ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, there are 4 of them, right? ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, East Asia, ASEAN Plus 3, 1997, East Asia Summit 2005, and then ADMM Plus is ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting. All these ASEAN-led mechanism, you know that the membership is quite remarkable. I would say that it's very unique, even so unique compared to EU. It is the only regional grouping that involve not just cooperation among the ASEAN regional countries, but also many sets of partners, dialogue partners, in and out of the region that includes all big powers. Let me emphasize, all big powers, including the competing powers, and also many key players in Asia, but also beyond, right? And we know that as we talk, Canada and EU, for example, have been knocking on our door. Can we join EAS? Can we join ADMM Plus? So with all the limitation criticism about ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism as talk shop and all that, you do see some values. If there is no value, I do not think that EU or Canada and other countries would be continue to knock on our door. So my final point would be, as I said, let's have some quick assessment and also analysis. So what is all these 3 I's have to do with today's situation? Should we in ASEAN region, Indo-Pacific and even beyond, be pessimistic or optimistic? My short answer within the time constraint that I have is that we need to be cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. And to highlight that, I think the key notion here is rules-based order. Rules-based order has been used for so many times in various contexts. I think one distinction that we in Southeast Asia see is that rules-based order certainly is a good thing, but we do not see that as a black and white. One power or one group of powers are pro, the other group are against. We do not think that there is such a dichotomy, black and white. We think that all powers, all players are sources of problems, but sources of solutions at the same time. Some ambiguity is needed. And why this is so? Very quickly, another set of 3 I's to illustrate that. The first I and the second I is about ideals and also implementations. Who doesn't like rules-based order? Everybody likes the ideals of open economy, the ideals of multilateralism, the ideas of open and transparency. We all love those ideas. So we in Southeast Asia, just like any other countries in global south and beyond, love a rules-based order. But the problem is the second I, implementation. There is a big gap as to why sometimes with all the idealistic norms and rules, but some rules are being implemented, some rules, are not being implemented, and so on and so forth. So we do not adopt a very clear-cut notion of rules-based order should be maintained, no changes whatsoever. We do not adopt that kind of approaches. Finally, the final point would be that since there is a gap between ideals and also implementation, So what should we do? And what does it, the main solution? I think the third and also the final I is going to be independent and also independently impartial. So ASEAN, Southeastern countries insist to not taking sides. We think that neutrality is something that we need to uphold. ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is different from other set of Indo-Pacific version in the sense that we emphasize inclusive. We emphasize that not taking sides because we know from history, the moment we side with one power against the other, that would not only be the end of ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, would be the end of a regional cooperation because the other power will compete and push back to do the same. So with that, let me end my presentation, and I guess there will be some questions later on. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for extending an invitation to somebody from a small island nations. It's great to have the opportunity to discover more about New Zealand's concerns and the way in which you're thinking about what's happening in Europe as much as thinking about your place in the world. So I'm very grateful for the learning experience. And my thanks to Serena Kelly from the University of Canterbury for facilitating my return here. So we've heard about ASEAN, and my brief is to look at Europe, and I think more particularly the European Union. And after the first two glass half full presentations, I think I'm a glass half empty kind of presentation because, of course, for Europe, really, our international relations is now a world turned upside down. You know, we're sort of the cockpit of where we're seeing the challenges to the international rules-based order, but we've also had our own regional rules-based order also significantly disrupted. And that's of some significance because Europe has often been presented as a case in reconciliation and a case in effective institutional region building. And I think it's probably fair to say that Russia's war on Ukraine means that for Europeans in the EU and outside the EU, that the threat from Russia represents an unambiguous state-based threat to European security for the foreseeable future. And that has significant implications for the institutions and the states that operate in Europe. And more than that, and this is also another shift that we've also seen, and I think this is quite unusual in a regional context, that a state has sort of moved to the fore as being the new fulcrum of the international relations of that Europe, and that's Ukraine, because the future of Ukraine's security, I think, is very much tied to the future of the international relations of Europe and how Ukraine is accommodated and how it's secured and how it is embedded within the institutionalization of Europe's international relations is a first-order challenge, frankly, for our politicians and our diplomats. The other thing I think that where we have exposed something that we were complacent about as Europeans, we used to pat ourselves on the back and saying, look, we've got so many regional institutions. We've got so many ways in which we can solve our problems. And when we identify a problem, we tend to create an institution to take care of it. But what we've seen is that some of the important pan-European multilateral institutions like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Council of Europe are now organizations in which they have highly constrained functionality. So we, in a way, the platforms that we had that brought Russia together with other European states, I think are probably in a place in which it's going to be very difficult to see them bounce back, frankly. In addition to all of that, as Professor Cheng said, you know, in a way, the sort of European story is how do you overcome conflict between states. We're also in a situation now in which we've had the necessary supply of arms to Ukraine to facilitate Ukraine defending itself, but we now have a situation of significant planned rearmament European states. So in a way, it's sort of back to the future for us in terms of the way that we've thought about and ordered our spending for security in Europe, particularly since the end of the Cold War. And that comes on top of the major arms agreements that conditioned Europe that were built during the Cold War, like agreements that were based on where conventional forces could be placed, so-called CFE treaty, which Russia pulled out of in 2015, and the INF treaty on intermediate nuclear forces. We don't have those arrangements in place. So we've gone from a situation in had a pretty robust institutional order, a pretty robust set of arrangements for managing security, but sort of born during the period of the superpowers. And we've sort of swapped what many saw as a pretty stable security order, one that's often contrasted to other regions, rather smugly, I think, to a situation in which we have a very less certain future, I think, in terms of how our regional order will be managed. And we've also got, I think, a number of blasts from the past, which might be sort of signposts to where we might actually end up in terms of what that regional order looks like. One, and this is an absolutely crucial one, I think, is the United States is basically being reconfirmed in its position as the leading actor in Europe's security because of the way that it has supported Ukraine in terms of diplomatic and military material. And that means we are now much more prone, I would suggest, to the vicissitudes of US presidential politics, which was flagged up in one of the earlier plenary session talks just after lunch. Also that NATO itself has sort of been restored in terms of being the sort of central European organization for collective security. And I'll come back to that point in a moment in the context of the EU in two important senses. One in which the way in which it's taken action, or the member states have taken action collectively to strengthen the defense of the member states which are on the borders with Russia. And in effect, NATO didn't really plan for a war with Russia after the Cold War, certainly since the large NATO enlargement. That is now radically transformed, and you see that in the new NATO strategic concept. But also the rapidity with which NATO acted in response to Finland and Sweden's desire to accede to the alliance. And that was a real sort of light speed type transformation in the way in which NATO has taken decisions. So the US is back. NATO, if you like, is sort of restored, and we've also had some pretty unprecedented actions on the part of the European Union. The support for over 4 million Ukrainian refugees who are residing in EU member states. The energy supply transformation that's taken place in terms of the switch away from Russian gas in particular, but also Russian oil. The radical breaking of a taboo when it comes to the supply of military equipment as a European Union through the use of the European Peace Facility, nearly 5 billion in military support to Ukraine, and the rapidity with which Ukraine was given candidate status alongside the scale and scope of the sanctions that imposed on Russia really demonstrate what I would call a sort of remarkable collective willingness to act on the part of European states, which is rather remarkable. And on top of that, we've seen quite significant transformations in the security cultures of a number of European states. Most obviously Germany with its so-called Zeitenwende process, but also Finland and Sweden, which had remained outside the NATO alliance, now in, but also the defense spending plans of European states. If you look at Poland, for example, Poland is going to be a major land power in Europe if it spends the money that it plans to spend. And that has some implications for the international relations of Europe. And it's also sort of re-credentialized the UK as a security actor, I would suggest, after being on the naughty step because of Brexit. And lastly, but by no means least, I think one of the things it's also done interestingly is sort of strengthen minilateralism in Europe. We've seen all sorts of groups like the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, but also groupings such as those that came together on the Tallinn Pledge. And all of those things suggest that how the states are lined up in terms of the institutional membership doesn't tell you everything about how states are aligned and all that. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about what I think are some of the implications for the EU, if that's okay, very quickly. One is, in 1 minute, one is who's going to do defence in Europe? The question was, how much was the EU going to do? Now that's much more of an open question. The EU was a sort of defence project, question mark against that. How the EU is going to deal with some of its structural challenges in the way that it does foreign policy. And I'll put those up for shorthand. The leadership challenge, really difficult to do foreign policy as a group of states. How do you do it effectively? What I call the fungibility challenge, how it deploys all of the assets that it has in a way that's effective and allows the EU to combine its capabilities in a way that's meaningful. And lastly, the legitimation challenge, how you actually legitimate when the EU is going to act, and that's empowered in such a way that the public is with you. That's been there on Ukraine, but it isn't there when it comes to thinking about China. Full stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had two very important conversations about regional organisations and the very clear limitations which both Professor Kuik and Professor Whitman see in terms of the capacity of regional organisations to deal with issues involving major states that are not part of their membership. We heard from Victoria a very good analysis about how at the global level the system is soldiering on, but how difficult it is to get things done. And I think that is a very good summing up of what we have heard in lots of other sessions in different ways during the course of the day. But this conference is about looking forward and finding solutions for the future. And I would therefore like to hand the floor over to all of you and see what questions you've got about the future and how it might be better. Please. Down the front.
Thank you for the presentations. And Colin, I wanted to say to you in person to thank you for your courage after 1994 and the Rwandan genocide. It's hugely influential. Makes me proud to be a New Zealander. And you're one of the reasons I went back to university as a mature student to do international law, because I wanted to understand responsibility to protect. So I've wanted to say that for many years. My question is simple, really. I think the way in which you reform multilateral system, and particularly the UN, is to get rid of the veto. And that's been the big bugbear. So I wondered if the panel can answer what is the mechanism they think that would be available to do that? Is it through the General Assembly? Is it through another mechanism? And how hopeful are you that we could do that? Because NATO is the only organisation really that's been able to act in a muscular way in response to the attacks on liberal values.
Who would like to start?
I'm not sure I would like to start, but I don't know, they're absent an absolute kind of bust up where the system is brought to ashes and we start again in some future point. I don't know a way to get rid of the veto. All I can imagine is the potential to progressively chip away at it and make it less used, less attractive, less available. And that would require some leadership from the other veto holders. There's only so much the General Assembly can do. It can, put the UN Security Council to shame a little bit when it's acting effectively. It can call the UN Security Council to account, ask it to explain. But the system we have has the veto built in, so there would have to be a willingness on those permanent 5 to progressively reduce the scope. Think of moratoria and how they've been useful. In many cases, in many countries, the death penalty enters into a period of disuse before a country is willing to actually abolish it. We've had other use of moratoria that have been effective. But do I think that the current geopolitical environment is ripe for that at the moment? I couldn't honestly say that I think it is.
Professor Kuik.
I believe the question is more about global multilateralism, and Victoria's question has addressed it. So I guess I just share some quick points, not so much about global multilateralism, but regional multilateralism, especially in this part of the world. Southeast Asia mainly, but also Indo-Pacific more broadly. So towards the end of my earlier remarks, I talk about independent, inclusivity, and also impartiality. So I actually put aside one very important point to mention. So in the real term, what does all this means? And especially for ASEAN and ASEAN dialogue partners in and out of the region, I believe the future for regional cooperation and even global cooperation has to be multi-layered partnerships. And at the regional level, it has to be ASEAN-centered regional multi-layered partnership. One good example would be RCEP. RCEP is something, it's not just about Southeast Asia. It's not just about the ASEAN 10 countries, right? But also the other 5 countries, including New Zealand, Australia, and the 3 Northeast Asian countries that cannot, for historical reason, cannot come together, although there are the 3 biggest economic powerhouses. But through ASEAN-based, ASEAN-led mechanisms, smaller states, regional multilateral platform, all these countries, very diverse, come together, came up with the RCEP after 8 years of negotiation, at the very, very difficult time that the humankind has been facing, right? During COVID period, there has always been a long list of bad news, but we have one good news, RCEP. That is one example to show that ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism is not just like a talk shop, just be very defensive and reactive, but it's actually very active and proactive, but quietly so. We are buying, we build cooperation, right? RCEP is one example. In the security aspect, ADMM Plus also continue to play a big role. So I do think that on the basis of what we already have, we need to build more layers along multilateral layers, along mini-lateral layer, and also endless bilateral, depending on the convergence of interest across the region.
Thank you. Richard, do you have any comment?
I'm not going to say anything about the UN. But the European case is instructive here. That how do you deal with veto players, and particularly on foreign policy issues? And the EU's danced around this for a long time. It's tried things like constructive abstention to allow states to stand back. But there's now a discussion that's cranked up again about whether you should have voting in the foreign policy area, akin to voting in other policy areas. And that's essentially to deal with the difficulties that have come up around one member state. Probably somebody in the room from Hungary over policy on Russia and Ukraine. My own view is that won't solve the problem. We'll get the problem that we've had in European foreign policy, which is lowest common denominator policy making if things are pushed to the vote. But I wouldn't read that across to the UN system, but just to illustrate, even when you've had 50 plus years of foreign policy cooperation, it's still a work of imperfection in terms of how you can get a group of states that do have very aligned foreign policy interests to come up with a decision-making arrangement that sort of is functional, effective, and allows you to take sort of timely action.
Can I look for some more questions? Yes, here in the middle. Yes, you.
My question, thank you very much. considering that we rely on finance, especially developing countries, to deliver those agreements into results for the citizens of the world, how do you propose that we can handle that challenge? Thank you.
Well, that's a challenging question to ask an international lawyer. There are numerous proposals out there to reform the international financial architecture and especially the international financial institutions. And then there are a number of other reforms. I would recommend to you a policy brief on the UN website on financial reform. I tried to read it on the plane yesterday coming up because I've been thinking about this, and it certainly contains a lot of potential suggestions. Then we have the fact that everywhere you look in the UN system at the moment, new funds are being created in order to get an outcome from the last Conference of Parties on climate change. A loss and damage fund was established. A fund was established in Montreal for the global biodiversity targets. We didn't establish a fund for the high seas biodiversity. Well, in a manner of speaking, we did, because in order to get agreement on the treaty, we have an agreement that all developed countries will pay an additional 50% of the normal fees that you would pay to belong to a multilateral environment treaty into a fund for implementation. To me, all these funds can only really be a stopgap measure. There is only so much money to go around, and many of the funds rely on voluntary contributions, which suggests to me that something more systemic is required. And that is where I think we need the people in New York to be talking more to the institutions in Washington and the regional development banks, because it does seem to me that there are solutions out there, but they require a different skill set, I suppose, than the skill set that many of us who frequent the halls on the UN on the East River in New York have. I'll pause there. There may be others. I'm sure, Colin, you've got views on this.
Well, let's get some more questions. Sir, we need a gender balance on our questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. My question is to Professor Kuik, and just thank you for that overview of ASEAN and its regional arrangement. But it sounded awfully familiar, particularly to the regional bloc just to the east of ASEAN, the Pacific Islands Forum. And I just wonder, in light of looking forward, and given there's a lot of similarity in the arrangements, in the partners that the Pacific Islands Forum interact with, and even with their interaction with ASEAN members. There are annual summitries between the Pacific Islands Forum and Thailand, and so they're also part of a dialogue mechanism as well. Do you see opportunity perhaps for the Pacific Islands Forum and ASEAN looking forward to become a more cohesive entity in light of what's going on around us? And given that the external partners that we engage with and also experience similar challenges with are the same.
Sorry, I thought we were going to take a few more questions.
Oh, no, you go ahead,
Oh, I'm
please.
sorry. Suddenly I realized the awkward silence, right? I'm sorry about that. All right, I think a quick response would be we need to perceive regional institutions, multilateral platform, bilateral diplomacy, so on and so forth, as part and parcel of the toolbox. For any problem, clearly we cannot just use one tool. you need to have a set of tools depending on the complexity of the issues. So for you talk about the ASEAN Regional Forum as one example, ARF. That was actually the first ASEAN-led mechanism that was established back in 1994. In light of the end of Cold War, we are searching and formula to cope with the unprecedented issue of how to deal with the post-Cold War strategic uncertainty. So in a way, I agree with you that there are some mixed progress when it comes to ARF performance. The good signs would be like ARF, when it was formed, it was only 18 members, right? And by now, it's already 27, 28. So the increased membership clearly shows that there are some potentials and expectations that ASEAN Regional Forum can do something. But clearly, I think in this, today, you can see that many are unhappy or unsatisfied, mainly because of, even though ARF provided platform for confidence building and also preventive diplomacy, but it has not really showed the teeth to manage the key regional defense security issue. Therefore, you see some non-ASEAN mechanism like Shangri-La dialogue, like clearly later on ADMM Plus also come into picture. So what I'm going to say is that despite the limitation that ARF has shown so far, I do think that we need to see ARF alongside many other mechanisms that is being developed. I do not think that we have reached the end point that we should not keep progressing. And this is not just for regional security issue. Even for economic issue, you would see some similar patterns, right? You need to develop something at the very beginning and then you add on other layers. One quick point and then I will stop is that ASEAN Plus 3 was established at the height of Asian financial crisis. And today you do see that the big impact have been being built from ASEAN Plus 3 with a very humble beginning involving 10 ASEAN countries and the 3 Northeast Asian countries. But today, I do think that when Mr. Anwar Ibrahim talked about Asian Monetary Fund recently, I think my Japanese friend would say that Japan was the one who proposed Asian Monetary Fund. But it was the conditions, political and economic conditions were not right back then. But today, I think we are in a better position. Why is that? ASEAN Plus 3 did give rise to some baby offspring institution in the form of Chiang Mai Initiative, 2000, right? That is a bilateral currency swap. And it took another 10 years. Good things take time to have multilateralization. So I think I would say that the Asian Monetary Fund proposal, it's in the right time to be developed based on what has already been developed in a concrete way.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question, and I think it goes to one of our key sponsors for this session. And please, Suze.
To any of our panelists, I want to ask you about the importance of political engagement in the multilateral process. I was struck by the comment that, for example, UNCLOS took weeks and weeks of ministerial time to negotiate. And today, as an observer, a lot of multilateralism can look like leaders flying in for a photo op and a handshake. And when you talk about Victoria, about the sort of 36 plus hours as hardworking officials in the room, I wonder, and with the complex risks we're facing, Europe must know only too well just how critical and existential those risks are. We've seen the Quad go up to now leader level, 5-port consensus for ASEAN needed to be at leader level. Shangri-La dialogue, how critical now it is to get those defence ministers together. What's your sense of whether we're seeing enough of that leader level ownership of the multilateral process?
Very quick answer from each of you, please.
I think I will. She can take my time.
Thanks for that. It depends a little bit on the subject matter. In the climate context, there are a group of climate change ministers that are very actively engaged in leading the work programs. The High Seas Biodiversity Treaty was a bit more technical, but the US representative, Monica Medina, actually was there all night as well. there was a French minister who attended significant portions of the negotiations. So particular individual ministers can make a difference. They also make a difference by calling together side meetings, engaging with their civil society, and coming together in their bilateral meetings. It all adds to the pressure. So I do think there is a really important role for political leadership, and often it's engaging with the political leadership can then connect with the wider interests outside the room to make things more possible for the negotiators in the room. I'll stop there.
Can I add just one last concluding thought on that question, which I think is of fundamental importance? People just don't appreciate how much leadership effort it takes to do hard things. When the United Nations Charter was negotiated in San Francisco in 1945, most of the technical details had already been resolved previously by officials. But our Prime Minister and Prime Ministers, Presidents from all around the world, from 50 countries, went to San Francisco. The war was not over. This was before Japan had been defeated. So in the middle of the war, they go to San Francisco and they remain there for 10 weeks negotiating the final 5 or 6 articles of the UN Charter. That's the effort that it took to get that over the line. Now, is it any wonder that, you know, a 2-day photo opportunity meeting of leaders on climate change achieves nothing? I mean, people are kidding themselves, frankly, in my view. It just takes that amount of effort. And so, I mean, I think your question's absolutely apposite. And until our collective political leaders, rather than just one or two, as Victoria said, there's some countries really get it. But it takes enough of the key leaders to be willing to put in their personal time. You did see an element of that in Paris with the Paris Climate Agreement, with only 1 or 2 items that they had to deal with. But it was a very incomplete agreement because they didn't put in enough time. Anyway, on that note, I think we have to finish because you are all required to be upstairs for the final summation, and you really do want to know what that's going to be all about. Thank you very much to our 3 speakers.